All right, so hi everybody, I'm Tanya. How many people in the room identify as a scientist in your background? Okay, a few. I'm glad there's at least a few. I'm going to talk about my career path today and how I transitioned from building an entire career on one planet and then deciding to make a complete right turn and move to an entirely different planet. And I called this the girl who came to Earth from Mars. So space has been a huge influence in my life ever since I was about 5 years old, thanks to a couple of pop culture icons that you might be familiar with. But it wasn't until the Sojourner mission landed on Mars in 1997, and unfortunately the animation isn't playing, but imagine a very adorable little rover driving off of that platform there. This was the first rover we'd ever sent to another planet, and I thought that it was so cool that we could do that. I knew I wanted to work on Mars rovers. And so I made a plan at the age of 11. So this is how I'm going to work on Mars rovers. I'm going to get a PhD, and then I'm going to publish some papers so that NASA will hire me to work on space missions, and then maybe one day I would be the first female head of a Mars mission. To date, that has still not happened from anybody, not just me. Since planets are in space, teenage me thought, well, I should major in astronomy. But it wasn't until near the end of my junior year of my undergrad in astronomy that I realized I was actually in the wrong place. Astronomy is really great in a planetary sense if you want to study exoplanets or planetary formation, but if you want to study the surface of a rocky planet like Mars or work on rovers, you really want to study geology or engineering. I am not good at anything with my hands, like building IKEA furniture, so I knew I was not going to be an engineer, so in grad school I switched to geology. And finally, I got to focus my research on Mars. Unfortunately, my grad school experience was kind of miserable, and so near the end of it, I wasn't sure that I wanted to continue on for a PhD anymore. And so as a scientist, you're kind of like, what can you do with a master's degree in geology? I didn't want to work for an oil company. So I started cold emailing people that were the authors of the papers that I read for my thesis research to see if any of them were looking for some kind of lab assistant or data processing person, because I'd done that in my undergrad with Hubble Space Telescope data, and I really enjoyed it. And coincidentally, one of those people emailed me back and said, you should look for jobs at this one particular camera company that builds cameras for Mars missions for NASA. And they happen to be hiring for an assistant staff scientist to work on cameras on the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter. Literally the day I found this out, I applied. I probably annoyed the heck out of them, letting them know how badly I wanted this job because the hiring process was very slow. But eventually, I got hired for the role, and my initial duties were working in ops for the Context Camera, or CTX, and the Mars Color Imager, or MARCI. And after a few weeks of training on this role, I got to take my first ever picture of Mars with CTX. And I'm really, really glad that it was something visually interesting, because some of these pictures are just broad, empty plains. But these are some pits on one of the volcanoes of Mars. And that was my job every day for years. It was literally to pick what that camera took pictures of on Mars. So I got to explore the whole planet every single day, and it was pretty amazing. With MARCI, however, instead of doing targeted imaging, we actually imaged all of Mars every single day in color so we could monitor change over time. So things like how the weather patterns change, how dust patterns on the surface change over time, and how the polar caps change over the seasons, because they actually grow and shrink. Eventually, I started working in weather support for Spirit and Opportunity using this camera, and then we also built cameras on board the Curiosity rover, so I worked in science and mission operations for those as well. So at this point, I was living my dream, and it should have been absolutely incredible, but unfortunately, I was pretty miserable because I was being very hostilely harassed by my supervisor at this company. And this person was extremely senior, and so the point of HR there dealing with it was essentially to try to convince me to quit my job. And I said, I am not going to quit my job that I love because someone else can't control their behavior. I held on for as long as I could, but unfortunately, it eventually got so bad that I literally applied for a job at Starbucks because I was ready to leave the field entirely. At this point, I was like 22 years old. Thankfully, in a moment of perfect timing, somebody that was working on one of the Mars missions that I was on had gotten a professorship at Western University and said, you should come and be my PhD student. Starbucks hadn't even called me for an interview with my master's degree in geology, so I was like, yeah, I'll go do this PhD thing, why not? So I moved to Canada, and I started working at Western. While I was there, I knew that I had made the right choice. At first, it was really hard because I went from a job where I had a real salary to taking a massive pay cut to being a grad student. But I eventually got the Vanier Canada Graduate Scholarship, which is Canada's most prestigious PhD fellowship. And so that told me I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Unfortunately, some health problems that I had been dealing with ever since I was a teenager decided to crop up while I was there. One is called ankylosing spondylitis. You can see that I'm standing right now. I had hip surgery during COVID, so I can walk, which is great. And ulcerative colitis. And unfortunately, the latter caused anemia that was so bad that I almost died during my PhD. And I had an 8-month period where I essentially couldn't leave my house. But I had a really fantastic network of lab mates and friends and a really understanding supervisor. And without that, I'm not sure I ever would have been able to graduate. So I really, really appreciate that. Western was such an amazing place. During this same time, I had started to get really active on Twitter. So if any of you are on Twitter, you might have seen me post about Mars stuff there. And I had realized that this wasn't just a platform where I could spread enthusiasm for Mars, but I could also share my story of being a queer scientist with a disability, because there aren't very many of us. And I know that representation is really important, because when I was a teenager and I started to get sick, I didn't think I would be able to do this. I never thought I would make it this far. And I didn't really have any role models to look up to other than Stephen Hawking. And I would look at him and say, if he can get up in the morning and teach a quantum mechanics class, you can get out of bed in the morning and go to your quantum mechanics class. So I'm like, okay, fine. So I started sharing my story through there, and it's been a really powerful tool. I've connected with so many people who message me either about the health problems that they're dealing with or things that their children are going through, and it's been really amazing just to connect with all of those people and try to show them that even if something like this gets in the way, it doesn't have to completely stop you from doing the things that you want to do. It might just be a little bit more difficult. But let's go back to academia. So as I was wrapping up my PhD at Western, I was figuring out where I was going to go next, and I got a call kind of out of the blue from Arizona State University offering me a job at their New Space Initiative, which was a group that was trying to make partnerships between the university, the government sector, and the New Space community to try and do research and development. They also said that I could work in mission ops on the side for opportunity and perseverance, which sounded really amazing. So I packed up my bags, I jumped in my car, and I moved from London, Ontario to Phoenix just a couple of days after defending my PhD thesis. And one of the first companies that I connected with at ASU was Planet. Since I was not from the space industry at all, other than this hyper-specific Mars stuff, I'd never heard of them before. But they said that they were a company trying to image the whole world every day to look for change. Does this sound familiar at all? This is exactly what I was doing on Mars. This company sounded really cool from a mission standpoint, wanting to see change to change the world, and from a cultural standpoint, just talking to a lot of the employees that worked there. They all seemed like amazing, amazing people and huge nerds. So I was like, this seems like my place. So I suddenly had an entirely new career goal, huge right turn. I really want to work for Planet. But then the question was, how does a Martian get a job on Earth? Literally all of my career was working on Mars missions, on Mars geology. The only stuff I had ever done on Earth was looking at landslides in the Canadian Arctic that kind of looked like Mars. So very, very hyper-specific skill set there. So I looked at the Planet careers page, and I sat down and I tried to make a list of my transferable skills. I had, it looks like this got a little messed up. I had about 7 years of mission operations experience on different missions. I had a PhD in geology and a ton of experience interpreting satellite images and processing them, and geology on Earth and Mars are very similar. I had experience with cameras and optics design requirements for satellites, and a camera is a camera regardless of what it's pointed at. I knew a lot of NASA lingo, which was very helpful in the case of the particular job that I ended up getting at Planet when I first started here. Oh, spoilers. I knew the research funding landscape because as a scientist, I had applied for a lot of research funding and gotten some while I was at ASU. And I had business development experience, which I didn't realize that's what it was for a couple of years at ASU, because that was not a term I had encountered as a scientist, but it's essentially what I was doing. I was connecting with companies to try to get them to partner with ASU. So after applying for 2 or 3 jobs that I didn't get at Planet, I eventually got hired as the manager of science programs for the federal arm, and now about 3 years later, I'm the director of strategic science initiatives for the entire company, where I act as an interface between the global research community and Planet. So what can you learn from this journey in trying to chase your dream career? First off, the biggest tip that I always give students is to be proactive, and I cannot emphasize this enough. Seek out opportunities, be ready to chase them when they arise, put yourself out there, network with people, let them know your skills, and let them know your goals so that when they hear about opportunities, they'll think of you for something that's relevant. Think about how to frame your experience in ways that are relevant to the jobs that interest you. So you might think, like I did, Martian landslides, how is that ever going to get me a job anywhere other than as a professor? Well, there are skills that you learn in the process of learning these things that you're doing in school or doing your internships that you can transfer to other things. So sit down there and think about that a little bit. This might mean that you actually have to tailor your resume to each job that you apply to for the maximum impact. If you're dealing with a disability or some kind of chronic illness, it doesn't have to be a permanent roadblock. It might just require some detours to get to that final destination. And I do not mean to make it sound easy, because it is not, but there are ways that you can try to make it work for you. And lastly, don't be afraid to change your path if some new opportunity comes up that doesn't play along with what you thought you wanted to do in the beginning, because where you end up could be even more incredible than you ever imagined. Thanks.